Welcome to Seek Justice, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the nuances of criminal justice. Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, Eric. How are you?
Pretty good. In a previous episode, you said we should start looking at some of the presidential candidates and what their policies are on criminal justice. And today you told me you would like to talk a little bit about this long page published by Bernie Sanders called Justice and Safety for All, where he outlines all of this stuff that he is certain he's going to be able to do as president. And I've been reading through it, and it all sounds good. It all tickles my inner liberal. I would love to have all of these things happen, but something tells me it's kind of pie in the sky that any of this is actually possible at all. Tell me what are your initial thoughts on this?
So he calls it a comprehensive plan, and it's actually a comprehensive set of ideas. For example, very little is stated about how he's going to get anything done, short of when it's clear that he could do stuff by executive order and rescind some of the things Jeff Sessions had done, and to end the rescindment of some issues that Sessions has done, for example. But a lot of it, I wouldn't say it's so much pie in the sky, because I don't want to denigrate it, because it's actually a very good list of stuff. It's like he got a bunch of liberal people together. I can imagine, 10 or 12 folks in a room with some academics and some researchers. And he said, all right, you're here for 3 days and you don't get to leave the room until you've come up with a comprehensive list of what we want to do. And so that's good. Mm-hmm. In fact, I've not, in my memory, I've not seen anything quite so comprehensive in terms of a litany of the things that are wrong. And so putting it all in one spot is very good, and I don't want to denigrate it.
Yes.
When we compare this to Elizabeth Warren's, which I haven't touched on, but I expect is, I would just guess, somewhat as comprehensive, but probably more planful. Mm-hmm. And then look at Joe Biden's, which I'm sure is less comprehensive than the other two, safer, and maybe therefore more realistic. But what I like about Bernie Sanders is that he's laying it all out there and saying, look, I'm sticking my neck out. I'm clear. I'm a social democrat, socialist democrat, or democratic socialist, whichever he prefers. And I'm going to lay all this stuff out there. So I like it. But here's where the problem is that it's wildly unrealistic to think that that's what he could do in 4 years. Now, remember, this is the same guy that's going to give health care to everybody and free education to everybody. And so it's like, well, with all that stuff going on, and I'm not clear about how you're going to get that done, what about all this stuff? And he, for example, says he's going to appoint people, like he's going to appoint a federal czar over prisoner reentry. Huh. All right, well, it's not bad to have people, delegated to do this stuff. But what's that person going to do? I mean, I'll give you the stark example. We've talked repeatedly, continually about ending mass incarceration and how implementation is so difficult at the state level or the local jurisdiction level.
Right.
And he says he has a goal, and it's an audacious goal, and I like that, of cutting the prison population in half.
Right.
All right, well, let's use that big, hairy, audacious goal. And then, so how do you do it? Well, he doesn't say. He's got some more control over the federal system than he does over the state systems, where he has very little control. And the federal prison population is only 12% of the entire population. So he could eliminate the entire federal population and still only be, 12% along the way or 6% along the way of cutting it all in half. So the question is, how do you do that? And so one of the things we can do this morning is take a look at some of these categories of activity that he wants to do. Mm-hmm. But it's really short on details. The other part of it is, to take that a step further, is that what I would like to see from a presidential candidate is this type of a comprehensive plan. And then at the end of it, say, look, I'm realistic. I know I can't get this done in 4 years. I probably can't get this done in 8 years. Go to this attachment, go to this document, this issue brief. That's an actual plan that prioritizes what I'm going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, et cetera, and categorizes that activity by what he can do that's under his authority through executive order, what he can do by a leadership position of promulgating stuff in the Congress. Mm-hmm. And I want to know, when I look at that part of the plan, how are you going to get by what is predictably going to be a Republican Senate majority? This is something that is I think we mentioned, the presidential candidates haven't talked about. 10 of them, 20 of them up on the stage, now reduced to the more workable number of 10 apparently in a week or so. Not one time have I ever heard any of them say, I'm going to have a challenge getting this stuff through the Senate.
Yeah,
moderators don't ask it.
It all feels very much like, when I get to the Oval Office, I'm going to have a magic wand and I'm going to be able to make things happen. whereas the reality is so far from that. You're not running to be dictator. We have this system in place that makes it really hard to do anything.
Well, and I'm more cynical than that. I would hate it if a presidential aspirant was in the magic wand category, or let's ratchet that down a bit and say that they're in the very hopeful, optimistic,
right,
can-do mode. That's all fine. I'm afraid, though, that that's not what it is at all. I'm afraid that what it is it doesn't matter what I say. As soon as I get in, I can say, wow, it's a bigger mess than I thought. I've had setbacks already, and I know I said all that stuff, but now I'm here and blah, blah, blah. And this is just a vote-getting apparatus. And
right,
while I think the world of Bernie Sanders, I think the world of all the top candidates, in fact, and the ones that I think are potentially electable, beginning with, I think, the most likely candidate to win the nomination is Elizabeth Warren, and then Joe Biden in second, and Bernie probably in third, because I think Bernie's too far left for most of the country. I'd love to see Kamala Harris do better, but I don't know that she will. And Cory Booker is absolutely great on this justice stuff, and as a mayor and as a legislative, I think he was in the legislature for a while, he's much more realistic, and he's got more of a heartfelt connection to it, because, as he has said, he lives in a neighborhood where within a couple of weeks, I think in the last debate, he said there were 6 or 8 shootings, near him, and that makes it much more realistic. I don't get that so much from Bernie, that emotional connection. But going back to what a real plan is, an actionable plan, some realistic set of expectations, and sure, be as heavy as you want in executive orders, be as heavy as you want on promotion of federal strategies that perhaps take any of these ideas and create pilot sites. What I'd like to see in this plan, as far as the work goes, is be heavy on executive orders, even if those executive orders are to create, using the federal purse through agencies that he controls, like the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Bureau of Justice Services and those type of agencies, Department of Justice and all their grant giving, to create pilots where some of this stuff can be tested out, and we can see what the actual impact is, and do that type of approach. So that becomes more realistic. The biggest bugaboo here, though, is what he's going to do with the states. And while this idea of pilots can help with the states, there's got to be an actionable plan that talks about bringing the governors together, perhaps through the National Governors Association and through the National Republican Governors Association and the National Democratic Governors Association, and bring those groups together and talk about what they can do and offer federal incentives to do that. Back in the day, go ahead.
Yeah, he mentions a bunch of times where we're going to withhold federal funds from states that don't do what we say as a motivation. And
that's not bad. That's not bad. The back in the day they had we'd have to check the notes for a date on this, but there was a truth in sentencing push some 20 years ago, and the federal government wasn't involved, and it was an example of a president wanting to see things change at the state level. So he said, look, if you don't if you don't increase the truthfulness of sentencing, at least so that people serve 85%, I think it was, of their actual uttered sentence, if you don't do that, you're not going to get road money. And so states lined up like crazy, and it was on the negative side of things as far as the research and as far as my ideas and our ideas go.
Sure.
But it was very effective. And then when that road money issue went away, all the states had laws, and many of them still do, that go at that 85% level or worse. And so it's an example of an incentive. I think a negative incentive isn't as good as a positive incentive.
Right.
And so there's a lot of things that can be done. And he uses these actionable words like incentivize and eliminate, and things like that. So we can touch on some of these, but that's my general thrust of it, and what I would say in general.
So why don't we go through some of these items line by line and discuss them?
Let's look at the categories. He starts out, with some good stuff about the wastefulness in the system, the high incarceration rate, the inability for that system to have much of an impact on crime, which is debatable. And then he talks about the racial situation, that it disproportionately falls on the shoulders of black and brown people in America, and that's true. He doesn't make the connections that he very well could about how the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States allows slavery, because that is a more powerful argument, but he makes the point nonetheless, and he opens it up only with a couple of paragraphs of stuff. But the first thing he talks about is ending profiteering,
right?
And it's really clear that that's a huge issue, and it's one that many of us have subscribed to for many times. And he says that he will ban for-profit prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, how do you do that? You do that through an executive order. Is that going to affect the states? The states are the ones who have private prisons. I don't know the extent anymore that the feds have private prisons. I think they have plenty of their prisoners in private prisons, and so he can do something about that. But he doesn't say that. He says he'll ban private prisons. He's going to make prisoner phone calls and communications such as video chats free of charge. How's he going to do that?
Yeah.
State budgets in corrections are built partially in many states on the income generated from the fees charged for telephones. When I worked in the department, yes, when I worked in the Department of Corrections in Michigan, the profiteering was built into our budget, and we had several $1 million a year that we raised that came to us so that the company that was charging made a handsome profit, and so did we. I was successful after I was in the governor's second term, Granholm's second term, to account for that profit margin being used to fund reentry so that one could say, well, we make money on this, but it's used to run these programs, which was an accounting trick. Because when you get money, it goes into a giant pot. There's no line item connection.
Right.
You can say the stuff, and if the line items match, then you can probably get away with it. I think it was more meaningful. It wasn't just a trick. But it's just an example of how tough it is. And he wants to incentivize states and locals to end police departments' reliance on fines and fees for revenue. How are you going to do that?
Right. Where's the money going to come from?
You can't do more with less. And it's a good thing. Now, what he could say, and he won't say this because I'm sure it would appear wishy-washy, is develop approaches and plans on how the federal government can have a hand in incentivizing states and localities to end police departments' reliance on fines. In other words, be more realistic about it. You know, right. a point of I don't like commissions and whatnot for the most part, unless they're very clear in terms of a short time frame, what the expectations are, et cetera. So here's a giant one, which is a liberal mantra. Remove the profit motive from our reentry system and diversion, community supervision, or treatment programs. Ensure people leaving incarceration or participating in diversion, community supervision can do so free of charge. He's saying he's going to remove the profit margin.
Right.
How is that going to happen? How are you going to control what happens in private companies, what happens in state governments? It's good stuff.
Right.
But it's like
it's impossible.
How?
Yeah.
How? Well,
it's not so much impossible, but
it's impossible the way that he writes it. As President Bernie will, no, he won't.
Right.
As President Bernie might, as President Bernie will want to,
will request,
will lead, right? He wants to end cash bail. So, you know, he introduces the No Bail Act of 2018. Very good, very good. Okay, how are you going to get it through the Senate, Bernie? How are you going to get it through the Senate? What's the incentivization? And what his response is going to be, as he says, I'm going to create a movement. Everybody will be involved. The movement will overwhelm. No, it won't.
Right.
And so there's a list of stuff that he's going to do there. He can end the use of secured bonds in federal criminal proceedings. I don't know that can be done by executive order. There might be some laws that have to be changed there. He can provide grants to states. That's realistic, to reduce pretrial depopulations. He can withhold funding from states. That's good. He can ensure alternatives, right? But how that's going to end cash bail and how he's going to get stuff through Congress is unclear.
Right.
So there's that. Then the next big heading is transform the way we police communities. And he starts out, which I don't think he does enough of in some other areas, where he starts out praising the police for gratitude and respect, et cetera. He should be doing that everywhere. I'd have to read a little bit more closely to see if he says the same thing about correctional officers who are facing, death potential every day in their workload. Right. Parole officers, same, and you get the sense when you read this thing that, geez, everybody's caught up in the system, these poor people. Well, there's an awful lot of very violent people in the prison system, career criminals in the system, people that need to be locked up, and from my standing, need to be locked up for the rest of their life because we cannot be safe in society with them running free. They're too far gone. It may include sociopaths and psychopaths, and there's data that shows this. When you look at, for example, what is the degree of, violent or nonviolent drug-related crimes in prison? You would read this thing from Bernie and think that it's a majority of the folks who are there, and it's really not the case. I mean, I think I mentioned before when I took a look at the population of prisoners in Michigan, and the activists in the communities were saying that we were locking people up for, possession. I didn't find anybody in prison who was just there. Not one person in 50,000 people in prison who were there for simple possession. It was all connected to somebody else.
Yeah, but
some other crime.
As a consumer of the liberal media, I was sort of under the impression that one of the reasons that we have prison overpopulation is this war on drugs, and that we're locking people up for silly stuff. That if we could legalize some more drugs, then they wouldn't have committed crimes. But that's just the sense that the liberal media is giving me. But not to say that all media is liberal, but you know what I mean. But in the bubble of content that I consume, I was under the impression that quite a large percentage is drug related, but turns out not to be the case.
Well, and you can link up this article by Raphael Manguel.
Yeah, I read that too. Yeah,
who comes at this, and he raises that issue, and then that it's about 15% of the folks that are in state prisons are there for drug offenses, and 88%, 4 times as many are murder, robbery, rape, assault, burglary, et cetera. But here's what he misses. And this is a huge misunderstanding or a misguided point that the right says, is that you've got to make a connection between drugs and all types of criminal activity.
Right.
When I was, I don't think I've told you this little vignette. I was in the Wayne County, Detroit jail and had a group of, I might say 60 prisoners who were in post-conviction incarceration. So they were serving their sentences there. And to test out, a theory I had, is that, so how many of you are here for a drug offense or, whatever? And it was less than 10% of all the people who were there. It was a pretty small number. And then I asked the question, more to the point, how many of you here for a crime you committed that were related to drugs? You either committed them while you're on alcohol or drugs, or you were incentivized for money to be able to buy alcohol or drugs.
Right.
85%, almost 90% of the people raise their hand.
There you go.
And so that's what's missing there. And so, it's an issue, right? But it's not as big as Bernie would say it. He would do better to add a sentence here or there, and actually take a page from the right and say, opponents of this will say this or that, but this is what they're missing. Mm-hmm. You would think that Bernie, at this point, after being a Socialist Democrat for so long, is used and would know what people are going to come at him for, and maybe pepper the stuff in there. But again, not to take away from the high concepts here, because I think they're good.
And he's not writing this. He's not writing this to defend against naysayers. He's writing this to potential liberals that would vote for him, I think. But
he's doing this to convince the people who otherwise would vote for Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden to vote for him.
Right.
And he wants to out-liberalize them. And as some would say, he is the one candidate who wants to out-socialize them, and he does so brilliantly, without remorse or exception, as opposed to others. Elizabeth Warren, for example, famously says, I'm a capitalist. In other words, I'm not a socialist, I'm a capitalist. And then she puts out a list of, fairly obvious socialist rather ideas, which, I certainly support. But this is what we're doing here. We got to remember these people aren't running for president yet.
Right. Exactly.
No, they're running for the nomination. And so who's more comprehensive? Who can, and this is Bernie's approach, and it's smart, I think, who can mobilize the folks that voted for Obama and then didn't vote for Clinton, who can mobilize the black and the brown voters of America, and importantly, and this is really critical for Bernie, given his whole history and approach, who can mobilize the millennials. Any mobilization, any victorious mobilization of millennials would tip the election.
Right.
But millennials, I think, are smarter voters in many respects, and I think they may want to know why as well. Although, how smart could they be when you look at the data that shows that many millennials that were supporting Bernie When Bernie lost the primary to Hillary, they voted for Trump because their primary issue was change, and Hillary didn't satisfy that. And I don't disagree with that.
Sure.
I do disagree with the idea vote for somebody who very likely is going to be worse and who's not particularly introspective on these issues. But everything has changed as a result of that last election. And so back to the list.
Yep.
There's some things in ensuring law enforcement accountability and oversight, rescinding Sessions' guidance on consent decrees, revitalizing DOJ investigations, et cetera. This is good stuff he can do.
Can you explain to me what Jeff Sessions' guidance on consent decrees was?
I think that we have to dig into this a little bit more, and we'll see whether you even keep this in there. But if there's a consent decree that says that a state can't do certain things because of a lawsuit that is pushed by the federal Department of Justice, that there may be in Sessions' directive is to do less with that rather than more.
Okay.
And so we can dig into that a little bit, but here's the point about that is that this is within his power. Right. Although one might argue that the Attorney General is there not to do the president's bidding.
Yeah, one would argue. Yes.
Although, but they're appointed. I mean, they're political figures, but on and on. And here he's got accountability guidelines, oversight for federal funds. Very good that he can do that. And federal programs that provide military equipment to local police forces. Well, careful. One of the things that you don't want to do as president of the United States, you don't want to piss off all the law enforcement agencies in the country and make them believe that you're so liberal that you don't support the fact that they are risking their lives every day.
Yes, but the local police departments have become so militarized lately, where if there's a report of a guy with a gun that's keeping his wife hostage or something, they will show up with almost tanks, really heavily armed vehicles and stuff. And I don't know. Sometimes it feels to me like we went a little too far in that direction.
Well, and you're the kind of guy who he wants you to vote. But here's the way that I would say that, being a bit more centrist, is consider the degree that local police forces are using military equipment and establish guidelines for continued purchase based on local plans. What you want to enter in a partnership at the federal level with police agencies, and you want to make certain that they have what they need. And I'm suggesting here that at the end, he may end up not providing any more money for military equipment because it very well may be that they have all they need. But I'm talking about the way that you write this and the way that you talk about this so that you don't aggravate what you're going to need to become president of the United States. People are not elected president from the left, and they're not elected president from the far right. They're elected from the center. The Democrats have a hard time because in order to win the primary, they go left. The Republicans have a hard time more recently because they're going far right. But frankly, the conservative Republicans have had have been more centrist than the far left Democrats over some of the elections. Look at Clinton. Clinton moved right into the center. He ended up acting, sounding, and then as a president did many, many Republican things, particularly on the criminal justice stuff. Clinton was more responsible for the increase in mass incarceration than any president in history, and Hillary Clinton supported it. And then she walked back. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to consider putting this stuff in there in such a way that it doesn't box you in so far to the left that you lose some of the support you might need. And so words are important.
But doesn't that always happen though? Everyone always in the primaries where you're fighting against people of your own party, running against people in your own party. Of course, you have to go extreme to get that vote, and then everyone sort of pulls towards the center when it comes to the general.
Well, I think when you're talking about big concepts, that yes, that's the case. But here we're talking about stuff that 99% of all voters are not going to read. We're way in the weeds.
Right.
What we're talking about here is way in the weeds. And so I'm looking at the laundry list here of ensuring enforcement accountability and robust oversight. And there's this one that I like the way it reads: provide grants for states and cities to establish civilian oversight agencies with enforceable accountability mechanisms.
Yeah, I thought you'd like that.
That's kind of a plan built into it, stuff that he can do. And it's worded in such a way And then a couple bullets above that, he's going to end federal programs that provide military equipment. Well, why do you word one in such a way that seems more plan-oriented and another one that seems more edict?
Right.
When the one that's more edict could end up costing you some votes,
Right. Yeah, I when I saw the enforceable accountability mechanisms, I thought Dennis is going to like this because you're all about enforceable accountability mechanisms.
So here's one I want to ask you about. Ban the use of facial recognition software for policing. I knew that would catch your attention.
It did.
What's your read of that?
It did. It depends on how good the facial recognition software is. Like, if there's a lot of things where AI is way better than humans at, especially with classifying images. In the UK, they've gone way to the extreme of having CCTV cameras just everywhere. And they can, using software, it's not quite like what you see in the movies, like with, the Jason Bourne movies where they like, oh, our computers have detected that he came out of a train station in Brussels. But there's a lot of stuff that computers can, at least, it shouldn't be definitive, but there's a lot of things where a computer can look through a whole bunch of images in a few seconds and at least highlight potential matches for someone that then I think a human should evaluate. But I don't know exactly how facial recognition software is being used for policing, but it doesn't seem like a bad thing necessarily, unless they're getting a whole bunch of false positives and putting people in jail for that.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing about this, and when I wrote policy papers, of course, for the governor to consider, they were evidence-based and they were just full of citations. And then when I wrote, based on the governor's review of that, when she would say, as she often did, hey, I like this is smart stuff, let's do an executive order or an executive directive, I'd write two versions of that order. One that was cited, so that, where it said, whereas, employability is important for reentry, there'd be a version of that cited the literature on that. And then there'd be a version that she would publish that wouldn't be cited because it was just too cumbersome, among other things. But it created for the elected official, in this case the governor, both the version that the public sees and then the version that you can use
to defend,
and your staff can use for Q&A and to defend it and to talk about why. This is an example where he's just got one line here, and there isn't anything else in here. This is all it says. Ban the use of facial recognition software for policing. Now, one might consider here that could say, ban the use of facial recognition software for policing because research has shown blah, 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 and add 4 or 5 words, but it's a little stark there.
True.
Let's move on to the next one, because I don't want to, there's a little balance here where he talks about stuff that I'm mentioning very well could harm the support of police agencies, where the next section is to provide more support for police officers and create a robust law enforcement
a non-law enforcement
alternative response system. And I'm looking at this, and there's like 6 bullets here, and where it says, the heading says provide more support to police officers, I don't see much more support. It's national standards for use of force by police that emphasize de-escalation, that's good. Require police officer training on implicit bias, that's good. With strict oversight, independent enforceable guidelines, that's tougher. Ban the practice of benefiting from civil asset forfeiture. Provide fundings to state municipalities to create unarmed first responders. Well, I can see how that's support, but boy, that's a tough one to consider.
That's a topic.
How they're going to be protected.
That's a topic that John Oliver covered one time, the civil asset forfeiture, where cops can just come and take money from you and be like, oh, because I don't know exactly how the law works, but it seemed in John Oliver's reporting, it seemed kind of ridiculous that so many law enforcement agencies were collecting and had quotas where they needed to collect a certain amount of money from people. Seems kind of crazy, but of course your police departments aren't going to like taking that away, right?
Well, it's money. I mean, it says provide more support to police officers. The last one is, incentivize access to counseling and mental health services for officers. Okay, you probably can do that. Diversify police forces and academies and incentivize officers to live and work in the communities they serve. This isn't a federal issue. This isn't even a state issue.
Right.
This isn't even a county issue. This is a city issue. Now, you might be able to incentivize that, but I'm not sure how that's going to happen. So look at this list. What it doesn't say here is what he wants to do to determine whether police agencies have enough staff to be able to do the work, and whether or not that staff is well enough trained in modern techniques of police forcing, including community policing. It's kind of odd that it isn't there because the subtitle is provide more support,
right.
And yet it looks like stuff that they would say would be more
restrictive.
Restrictive, right? So there's a section in here on ensuring Americans' due process, and I think we may end up doing this in two parts,
sure,
because there's too much of it. Because there's a whole section here on reentry and whatnot that I want to get to, but I don't want to skip over the stuff.
No.
So he's got right to counsel here, which is important. And the first thing he hits on is he wants to triple national spending on indigent defense to $14 billion annually. Doesn't mention how he's going to raise, another $10 billion or $9 billion. I mean, I think I know how he's going to do that. And since I'm doing my taxes this week, and a whopping 35 cents of every dollar I make as a small business person is going to taxes, almost 30% of that to the federal government. You look at some of his other stuff. He wants to cut defense spending. He wants to do this, but he wants education for all. It's like, man, oh man, Bernie, that's a big ticket item. A lot of these are. He wants to set minimum starting salary for public defenders. Cha-ching, a national formula to assure populations have a minimum number of public defenders, which is presumably as increased funding would do. I don't know if $14 billion is enough, but here we have.
I mean, it seems like we could say double the number of public defenders, and still their caseload would be plenty.
Well, but take a look at what happens in New Orleans, the state of Louisiana. Look at Detroit, look at some of the big cities. You're going to see some incredible data. And this isn't going to fix it. Here's one of the overall points about this. This is not a federal issue.
Right.
This is a state issue that the feds can help. I'm not reading it. He wants to create and set a national formula to assure that populations have a minimum number. Okay, I think we can do that, particularly if it's tied to federal funding, and he can have federal guidelines and goals for right to counsel. Now he wants to create a federal agency to provide support. Oh my God. If you're going to do this stuff, provide the money to the local systems. I don't want any more bureaucrats in Washington. I walk the streets of Washington, D.C., and see building after building after building. They're taking federal money. They're pushing the money into states. The states have their bureaucracies. And it's like, Bernie, you're growing government here, man. That ain't socialist. Of course, it is socialist, I suppose. But, and then I'll cancel all existing student debt and cancel any future student debt for public defenders.
That's his big. The student debt thing is his basically paying millennials to vote for him because they're all so neck deep in debt that makes him a really compelling candidate, I would think, to millennials.
So anybody who becomes a public defender has all of their student debt eliminated. And if they're going to cancel any future student debt, I don't know. I'm not sure how you do that. I'm going to be a public defender, so I don't have to pay. He's got a public service loan forgiveness program that he wants to put into place, and so there's some planning there. And next he jumps into ensuring accountability and fairness in prosecution. Prosecutors today have undue discretion in deciding which cases will be charged, and they're largely protected from liability when they break the rules.
Sounds like something we discussed.
It's true.
Yep.
It's true. There's guidelines for judges. There's guidelines for a lot of folks. There's not much guidelines for prosecutors, and I've worked on guidelines, and they don't want any guidelines. And so you've got this obvious imbalance, which is a liberal imbalance between what he wants to do on right for counsel and what he wants to do on the other side, which is prosecution. And he doesn't say anything here good about prosecutors. And I don't think that's the way that you write public policy. If it weren't for prosecutors in this country, crime would be rampant. Right. You can't beat up police departments and beat up prosecutors and put them in the category of the evil army. You could, in the research that I may have mentioned in some of the other podcasts, when you want people to listen to you, you need to use a ratio of 5-to-1, 5 positive things to 1 criticism. And he would be smart to do that.
Interesting.
he does a little bit, like when he opens up the thing about police officers.
But as you were saying, he needs a lot of the voters of color that Obama got to win the election. And I think potentially demonizing prosecutors and police might be a strategy to accomplish that. Whether or not it's good for governing later is another question. But I don't know, just a thought.
So here's my point, though, on exactly what you said. I think that's right, but this is what he opens up with police agencies. The people who serve our country as police officers deserve our gratitude and respect. As a country, though, we're asking them to do far too much. As human beings, we all share common vulnerabilities, and we all share basic needs to live a stable and dignified life. Okay? Here's where we go with prosecutors. Ensuring all Americans are due process. The criminal justice system is rigged, which, then he goes in about corporate, et cetera. That's the entree to the right to counsel. And when he launches into prosecutors, he doesn't say anything about gratitude and respect.
No.
Prosecutors today have undue discretion in deciding which cases. They're largely unprotected from liability. They have advantage. It's Bernie, put a sentence in there about what we appreciate about prosecutors, because we have to be fair. What does he want to say when he sits down for coffee with Kamala Harris? What does he say to her? You're part of the evil empire? What did you do? Kamala Harris's resume is full of stuff that she did as a prosecutor to forward justice. And there, as we've talked about, they're in a significant position politically to do some very, very good things because people will listen to them because they're more centrist. Now, they are less liberal, they're more conservative. That might get, some people the heebie-jeebies, especially, Bernie. But nonetheless, we've got to acknowledge that the justice system would come to a halt without plea bargaining, and he says that they've got an advantage in plea bargaining. People in jail without financial resources are more likely to plead guilty than fight the case, et cetera. All very true. The vast majority of cases end in plea agreements. That's true. But here's the fact. If we didn't do that, the criminal justice system would come to a halt. Mm-hmm. And I think he's got something in here about...
Well, here's a line that it relates to stuff that we've talked about. Place a moratorium on the use of algorithmic risk assessment tools in the criminal justice system until an audit is completed. We must ensure these tools do not have implicit biases that lead to unjust or excessive sentences. For sure, yeah. But you've been a champion for the algorithmic risk assessment tools over the course of this podcast. But sure, obviously we want to make sure that they work. But how do you do that?
So hey, listen, man. Bernie should know this, and his researchers should know this, is that it is case law that an actuarial risk assessment tool cannot be used as a sole set of information for sentencing. It can be used as one of many inputs.
One would hope, yeah.
It's a case law. It's been decided, and it's in case law in Indiana. We can connect to the show notes if you want, but it's not used now for sole decision purposes. Whether you're doing it in pretrial programs, in jails, everywhere, it's a guide for people who have to make decisions to use. And so this is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. You want to place a moratorium. We have significantly increased the evidence-based approach that we see across the country when these tools are used smartly. What he would be smarter to say here is to create a set of standards on the use
guidelines of
actuarial risk assessment tools that includes making certain that there are no implicit biases.
Yep.
But to place a moratorium, look, right here, this is one of the reasons I'm not voting for Bernie Sanders, and I supported him in the last primary. I'm not voting for him partly because of this and partly because of all this stuff. I don't think he's particularly electable at this point either.
He seems,
but this is the kind of
between this and the facial recognition thing, he seems a little afraid of tech in a way that's.
Well, how did this come about? What was the process that he had?
Yeah.
And you know that it was a room full of people writing. He's probably, I would say it's a 3 to 6 month process probably. There might have been 20, 30, 40, 50 or more. He's got some academics that are at the table. There probably were a lot of arguments. There probably was a mixture of left wing and more centrist folks at the table. And very likely there's a bunch of stuff in here. There may have been only one person who knew much of anything about it. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't anybody to argue with that person about it, and it made it in here. I don't know that he did due diligence on this. I think he's more interested in having the most comprehensive list and outcomprehensiving. And it's a mentality that I don't like it. And so, and again, a lot to be said about it. I think in balance, even though I'm being quite negative about this particular piece, I think there's more good here than there is bad, but obviously only at the very high conceptual stage, unless he's got the stuff under his authority, which in many cases, as we've talked about, it is. So now we got a section ending mass incarceration and excessive sentencing. And he's got some stuff in there that's true. He wants to abolish the death penalty.
Okay.
Good. How do you want to do that, Bernie? How do you want to abolish it? How do you want to do something that the liberals have been wanting to do forever, and in some states have succeeded? How are you going to do that as president? You're just going to abolish it? Can you do that? I don't think so.
Pretty sure.
I don't think that's an executive order.
Yeah.
I think this is a state-by-state issue.
The death penalty, I would think, is going to be, if it ever goes away, it's going to be because the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional, I would think.
They haven't yet.
I know, and
the Supreme Court isn't.
This one isn't gonna. So maybe maybe 50 years.
Here's two of these that signify the throw my hands up in the air like Bernie would do and say, how are you going to do it? Stop excessive sentencing with the goal of cutting the incarcerated population in half and mandatory sentencing minimums.
Yeah,
these are state issues. How are you going to do that, Bernie?
Those are things that, yes, we want to do, but you can't just say it.
And 3 strikes laws. All right, great. How? Invigorate and expand the compassionate release process so that people with disabilities. Okay, now this is stuff that I tried to do at the state level. It's damn near impossible to do it at the state level. When we were in the governor's office, we had a Republican House and a Republican Senate for the first term. We had a Democratic House and a Republican Senate in the second term. We couldn't get jack shit passed because we kept coming into roadblocks unless it was, bipartisan. And this isn't, stuff that starts out very bipartisan. And so you get into all sorts of questions here. And as a litany list, great. I'm glad that a presidential candidate finally has said, this is my goal. And it's interesting where it's almost like in the first part of this, in several of the sections, his staff, and I think he's kind of a hands-on guy. Remember in the debate that he said that he wrote the damn legislation himself over some issue that came up.
You don't know that, Second Bernie. Of all, we'll come to you in a second, I do know, and I wrote the damn bill.
And one of the respondents said, I think it was, I don't know who responded and said, yeah, so now you're writing your own legislation, right? And he may say, yeah, I actually spent time doing that and edited it. He might. So he may be more hands-on. But it seems like they took a little bit more care and time in the sections above this. And when they got to this, it's like, oh, hell, we've run out of time. We've run out of steam. We've run out of ideas. And so they're not using, so they just start abolish the death penalty.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what he might say, I am unabashedly going to do everything in my power to end it. That's great. I'm glad you got that audacious goal. But this doesn't say what your goal is. It says what you will do. How will you do it?
Right.
How will you win? And
yeah, all of these,
frankly,
all of these lists should be preceded with, as President Bernie will try to, as opposed to
which of course any campaign person is going to say, don't do that. That's wishy-washy.
Of course.
But I think it's better to say what you will do and what you want to do to end mandatory sentencing minimums. You want to look at who is controlling that. It's state legislators. And who are those legislators? Where are they getting their information? What incentivizes them, et cetera? That's how that has to happen. He uses that type of stuff in the earlier parts of the proposals, but then he gets to here and he doesn't do it.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like he ran out of steam, and maybe that he just took the red pen to the stuff and said, no, I want it to be shorter.
Right.
So here's and 3 strikes laws. No one should spend their life behind bars for committing minor crimes, even if they commit several of them. Well, okay. How are you going to get state legislators and state legislatures, both House and Senates, both Republican-controlled and House-controlled, to actually end it, Bernie? How are you going to do this over the course of what, 1 term, 2 terms?
Right.
How's that going to happen? How are you going to list governors? How are you going to list the incentives that you said earlier? You can use all sorts of incentivized approaches, whether it's negative incentives that you don't get money if you do this, and positive incentives you do get money if you do this. But I don't know why he stopped there. Stop the criminalization of homelessness and spend more than $25 billion over 5 years to end homelessness. This includes doubling McKinney-Vento homelessness assistance grants to build permanent supportive housing and $500 million to provide outreach to homeless people to help them connect to available services. In the first year of this plan, 25,000 housing trust fund units will be prioritized for housing the homeless. So here we have a whole paragraph, a run-on sentence, and then a short sentence. No, 3 sentences. It's actually 3 sentences. Why, in a plan, does he have 3 sentences here that give us a better idea? Of course, again, $25 billion from where?
Yep.
Right. But when you move that, he says what he wants to do in the first year. So one would think, well, that had some more thought to it. So here's where I would start and prep for another session. Does Bernie have a team of people working now on developing plans of action for each of these, or is he going to do with every elected official I ever worked with, except for Governor Granholm, who did a very good job of requiring pre-election the people that were recommending policies there to have plans of action. And then she measured at the end of the first year what percentages of the promises she kept. And the agency that I was in, Department of Corrections, scored highest than any, because we did more planning than any. And we also had connection between the campaign policy writers and people who were in the administration. But maybe he's doing that. Well, if he's doing that, he should have put that in here. So I suspect that he's not doing it.
Yeah, and investing a whole bunch of money into the governing when you're still a candidate, one would like your candidates to do that, but I don't know how the incentives work out with that.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I'd like to do a part 2 here and just pick up right where we left off.
Yeah.
And then I'd like to plan another one and jump into Elizabeth Warren's, and we'll see what the polls are like there. I'm not all excited about Joe Biden, and frankly, I don't think he's likely to win the nomination from my gut. But we may want to look at that as well, because that one would be fun, because he was partly responsible for creating the mess we're in the first place, and there's no getting around that.
Right.
And we'll see. But his numbers are going down, and Elizabeth Warren's are going up as we speak. So we can go from there.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you've just heard, you can support us by telling a friend or sharing us on social media. All of our episodes can be found on our website, seekjustice.fm. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we can be reached at seekjusticefm@gmail.com or via our Twitter account @seekjusticefm. See you next week.